Okay, guys, welcome to the American History Fall Semester Test Review. This test is going to be 50 questions covering essentially from the Civil War up to World War One. All right, so let's jump into it, guys. First up, let's talk just a little bit about the Sherman Antitrust Act. This is going to be out of the Gilded Age period when big businesses are really taking advantage of people. The Sherman Antitrust Act is important in that it's going to make the formation of these trusts illegal. It's kind of one of the first times that the government really does anything against the businesses, basically to help competition. So Sherman Antitrust Act's making things illegal, making trust illegal. So pretty important there. Now, speaking of robber barons in the Gilded Age here, remember that these are these guys like Andrew Carnegie and J.D. Rockefeller. They're basically these monopolists who they're using the system of capitalism to be incredibly wealthy, very much so. This is a time period of great immigration to the United States. There's a lot of jobs. Here, it's a land of opportunity. Out west, you have a lot of Chinese and Japanese immigrants coming in. And the immigrants who come in through the west are going to come in through Angel Island. A misnomer, because it is not an easy place to come in. The conditions there are a little worse than what they are over in Ellis Island in the east in New York. But Asian immigrants going to come in through Angel Island. Now, you got so many immigrants floating around here that you, of course, get a big push from Native American, not Native Americans, but people who have lived here in a movement called nativism. They kind of want to get rid of the Irish. They want to get rid of the Chinese and the Asians and peoples like that. They want to go back to this, Anglo-Saxon American that they're used to. But yeah, nativism movement becomes big in this time period because of everybody coming to the United States. You also in this time period have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which it's a restriction on Chinese immigrants coming to the United States. The railroads were built. People were tired of the Chinese coming over here. They weren't speaking English and stuff, and it bothered some of the Americans. To the point that they put pressure on the government to restrict these Chinese immigrants. Now, people are flocking to the cities because that's where the jobs are. And this is, something called urbanization, this mass rush to get to the cities, to the opportunities there. And that creates a lot of problems. Crime's a problem. Sanitation's a problem. Fire's a problem. One house or one building goes up in flames and it spreads very easily in these cities. Now, one thing that isn't a problem, of course, is the fact that there are incredible amount of jobs there. That's the reason for the urbanization in the first place. Now, political machines emerge in these cities, partly because of the immigration issue. And that's where political machines are going to receive their most power. It's the immigrants that give them power. They're trading services for votes. They promise immigrants they'll take care of them if they vote for them. And for the most part, they do. However, along the way, remember that the political machines are going to become pretty corrupt. Now, there were ways that cities dealt with some of their problems. Skyscrapers was a way to deal with population, with urban sprawl. Mass transit was a way to deal with transportation issues. City planning was a good way to kind of help these cities overcome the trials of so many people coming to them. And a big movement that comes out of all these issues is something called progressivism. And progressivism, they have some goals, such as they want to foster efficiency. They want things to be more efficient. They want to protect social welfare. They want to promote moral improvement. But one of the things that progressivism is going to kind of fail in is they really do nothing towards civil rights. They're not worried about making sure that African Americans are being able to use their right to vote in the South. So progressivism doesn't really move towards that direction. In the 20s, the roaring 20s, we get an American president named Calvin Coolidge, squeaky clean president following Harding's administration. And his famous quote is, "The business of America is business." That's really what you need to know about Calvin Coolidge. And the 20s is a good time period for America. It's also a time period where women are going to try to kind of push, their agenda, their rights. And one of the groups that does this is the Flappers. They're rebelling against sexual norms. Going to cut their hair. They're going to do things that women weren't supposed to do, to just really to make a point. There was also a major event in the science versus Christianity argument of the 1920s, which kind of rears up out there in Tennessee. And it's called the Scopes trial, where you have John Scopes illegally teaching evolution in Tennessee, which had banned the teaching of evolution in their science classes. Scopes is going to do it really just to make an issue of it, so that this can play out over the radio, and Americans can, see what's going on with the issue of science versus religion. You get the Harlem Renaissance, of course, which is this reemergence of Black culture and art in New York. That happens in the 1920s as well. You get Langston Hughes, the poet, and some other good ones coming out of there. You also, in this 1920s period, you're going to get a move towards something called prohibition, which, of course, is the banning of the drinking, selling, and transportation of alcohol. However, prohibition is only going to last for a few years before they repeal it, because the law is unenforceable. There's no way, you don't have enough people to keep people from, not enough law enforcement to keep people from drinking. It's going to lead to the rise of gangsters like Al Capone. And we generally say, just let the people drink, because it was less of a big deal there. Step back just a few years, talk just a little bit about America in World War I. And, there were 3 reasons why America went into war. The loans, of course, that we gave to allied nations. We couldn't lose that. That was very important. Unrestricted submarine warfare was also a big reason that we went in, Germany sinking our ships. And of course, lastly was the Zimmerman Note, which was this alliance with Mexico. All right, those were the 3 reasons for America entering World War I. Now, American soldiers came into the war late, and they had that colorful nickname of the Doughboys. We might not have been very prepared for the war, as the other ones had 3 years experience on us, but we're fresh and we're energetic, and we're going to be a tide turner for sure in the war. We go back a little bit to Teddy Roosevelt, and there's a lot, of course, about Teddy Roosevelt. Remember that he has that huge reputation as being a trust buster. He's huge on conservation. He loves protecting nature. Teddy's got his hands in a lot of things going on in the time period. You get the, Spanish-American War, where Teddy's involved in. And in fact, in the Spanish-American War, if you'll remember, the USS Maine explodes, although we know now it's an accident. At the time, it was blamed on Spain, and gives us a reason to go to war against Spain. And Teddy was, he led the Rough Riders there in Cuba. Assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand puts America into World War I. We know that trench warfare developed there in the Western Front. A lot of senseless killing there. In World War I, you saw the emergence of a lot of new weapons of war, such as tanks, machine guns, even mustard gas. These were some of the big ones, of course. And while this is all going on, you have a large domestic migration going on in America. You have something known as the Great Migration, where African Americans are, fleeing the South and flocking to the North because of all the job opportunities, because of so many white men being pushed into military service. Now, the Great War is devastating, and Woodrow Wilson tries to keep us out of it as long as he can. And when it's all said and done, he does want, he goes about trying to set up an international peacekeeping body in his 14 points. His 14th point was, of course, the League of Nations, which, is going to try to keep countries from going to war with each other. And the 20s is great. The 20s following World War I, America's a superpower. But the Great Depression is going to appear in 1929. And there are many causes of the Great Depression. You had a farm sector crisis. They were trying to compete against European farms that were now back. Easy credit. It was too easy for people to get loans, and then they couldn't pay back their loans, which put the banks in crisis. And you really had an unequal distribution of income. The rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. So those are all causes of the Great Depression. Now, we got to go back just a little ways. And we'll go back to the very beginning here and talk just a minute about the Civil War. And when Civil War began, remember this about Abraham Lincoln. His goal at the beginning of the Civil War is simply to restore the Union. It's not to free slaves, but merely to restore the Union in any way that he can. Um, Now, eventually, 2 years into the war in 1863, he is going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which abolishes slavery both in the North and any Southern states that are in secession. Of course, we know that that's really only as good as the paper it's printed on, but it does set a precedent. It does change the meaning of the war to restoring the Union to freeing slaves. Um, Now, the whole Civil War thing, if you remember, really starts with the attack on Fort Sumter. And, Lincoln, he doesn't want to start the war, and he doesn't want to anger the Republicans, and he doesn't want to anger the slave states that are still in the United States. So he's not going to attack at Fort Sumter. Remember, he's going to resupply the men stationed there. And that means that the South is going to end up firing on the fort, and it's going to start the war. So Lincoln was very clever there. Now, out of the Civil War, we get three very important amendments. The 13th Amendment, you better know it, is official end of slavery in America, anywhere in America. The 14th Amendment makes all persons born or naturalized in the United States citizens. So it gives citizenship status to the freed slaves, basically. And the 15th Amendment is a protection for voting rights of the slaves, because the South was, being difficult to work with. Now, after Civil War, during Reconstruction, you had Republican control in the South, but many white Southerners, they are not accepting equal rights for blacks, and so they really make it difficult for the Republican governments there in the South, to the point where the Northern government, the Union, or the United States of America really at this time, is going to send troops into the South to limit the violence that's going on and to keep African Americans and white Republicans from being intimidated. Agents like the KKK and others who are, trying to keep them from voting. Now, we talked about this a couple times a little bit later, early 1900s, going back to the business issue where bosses weren't treating their employees very good. We had the terrible tragedy of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. 146 ladies are going to die because they're locked into their factory because the bosses didn't want them sneaking out for smoke breaks. So they locked them in, and when it caught fire, they had nowhere to go but out the window. So a major tragedy there. It's going to lead to better things in the business sector. And we talked a little bit earlier about skyscrapers and their role in helping urbanization and helping mass population come into the cities. Without new methods of making steel, without the Bessemer process and things like that, it'd been impossible really to construct these enormous skyscrapers. Let's see. You had, in this Gilded Age time period, you had a lot of shady stuff going on, and it took the important work of journalists known as muckrakers, these journalists who would go undercover, and their whole role was to expose the corrupt side of businesses. And they get that name, they're raking through the muck. So muckrakers, that's their job. They're going to expose the corrupt side of businesses. Prohibition, again, we talked about it a little bit already, so I won't go back over it again. You also have some wins by progressivism during this time period. More power for the people, basically, is what you get with progressivism. And one of the powers that the people get is something called initiative. And what that is that if people can put forth the law themselves and not have to wait for Congress, which is usually the institution responsible for creating laws, the people actually have a right to create laws. And this bill originating with the people is something called an initiative. Remember that suffrage is the right to vote. We talked a little bit about the robber barons. Remember who it was that founded U.S. Steel? That was Andrew Carnegie. J.D. Rockefeller, of course, was part of Standard Oil, but it's Carnegie that is the U.S. Steel guy. Let's see here. Going back to Reconstruction. You need to know what ends Reconstruction, and very simply, that is the Compromise of 1877. You have a disputed presidency. Republicans want their guy, their Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, to be president. The South is resisting, and so they basically offer the South a compromise. We will pull troops and end Reconstruction in the South if you let our guy be the president. And so the South jumps on that, and so the compromise of 1877 is going to end Reconstruction. Now, before all that went down, the Reconstruction plan itself, there were several. It started with the 10% plan by Abraham Lincoln. And remember that 10% plan, the whole idea with it was that 10% of eligible voters in the South would swear allegiance to the United States. A very soft and lenient plan. It did draw some criticism, but it was Abraham Lincoln, and so he had built up a lot of credit. Now, for African Americans, they're free, but for most of them, they're going to be right back on plantations working as sharecroppers. Technically not slaves, but it's not much better, to be honest, and possibly in some cases even a little bit worse. During this late 19th century period following the Civil War, following the Reconstruction, you had guys out there. You had the rise of something called yellow journalism. William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer were the guys that kind of really got this going. They were in a competition to sell newspapers in New York City. And so they're going to sensationalize things. They want to draw your eye. They want you to put your quarter in the slot and buy you a paper. You had the Great Strike of 1877, and that took place in the railroad industry. Terrible wages, terrible working conditions. People really got fed up, and so they went on strike. Actually ended up with a couple of dead workers, unfortunately. And lastly, the idea of social Darwinism during this time period is used to justify several things. The existence of poverty, well, it's because those people are lazy and stupid. The success of big business, because those people are smart and hardworking. The power of millionaire industrialists, that's all social Darwinism. It's all deserved. What you're not going to see social Darwinist support was government regulation of business. So keep that in mind. All right. These are your topics for your American History fall semester test. Hopefully you can go through and review these enough to be successful on your test. Good luck.